Hi everyone, I'm Jane Shou, Serious Description Librarian and Government Document Coordinator at Duke University Libraries. And I will be your on-camera moderator today. Thank you all for joining us for the 31st Annual North Carolina Serious Conference. We will have a Q&A period at the end, so please just drop your questions in chat and we will bring them into the live stream. Our first presenter is Elizabeth Speer. Please, Elizabeth.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Collection and Vendor Relationships, Diversity Evaluation and Communication. I am Elizabeth Speer. I'm the Electronic Resources and Acquisitions Librarian at the University of North Texas Health Science Center in Fort Worth. And today we are going to briefly discuss the following points. This is going to be the driving forces behind our project, our identified near-term actions, our project objectives, our roadblocks and solutions, our vendor communication, the effects on our collection, and what we're going to do moving forward past the initial year of this project. So why did we suddenly decide it was time to evaluate our collection for diversity? What were our driving forces? First, there were national events which brought to the forefront issues with discrimination and racism. Second, there was a large concentrated shift on campus to embrace a more diverse campus culture. And then on June 12th of 2020, Dr. Charles Taylor, who is our provost, sent out a message to the university that was entitled, "Together We Stand as One University." This message followed statements by HSC and UNT's presidents and chancellor, and all of their statements were in direct response to senseless deaths and systematic racism. And these messages really pointed the future path for HSC in regards to diversity. There is now a really strong focus on campus values across our campus, and these are those values. And you see they include things like integrity and serving others first and respect. And we really felt that by looking into the diversity of our collection that we would be able to focus on these values and potentially make a difference. And finally, as a medical institution, we were aware that there is a glaring lack of diversity in medical literature as a whole. So in his letter to the university, Dr. Taylor identified 3 near-term actions for us as a system. And the first was assistance, the second was dialogue, and the third was awareness. We were asked to turn our focus toward what we offered so that we could access available resources. They really wanted us to look at what we already had and how we could potentially use those better or make what we had more usable. We were asked to look at how we communicated with each other and with our external constituents, what we currently do, what we could do better, and what we could do differently moving forward. And then we were asked to look at all of our opportunities across campus with a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we were asked to look at things in a way that maybe we hadn't done before. So as we began to look into our practices, we became more aware of certain things. In respect to DEI, we believed that there was a lack of diversity throughout our collection. The medical images that we subscribed to were particularly problematic, and we knew that medical literature is traditionally homogeneous. As far as documentation, we started looking at our documentation practices. We found that DEI was not actually documented as a purchasing factor, nor was it discussed with faculty when purchasing requests were made. So it wasn't something that we even considered when we thought about adding resources to our collection, and we determined that that was going to be a problem. And then we began to look at our communication strategies. We evaluated both internal and external communications. We looked at our policies and forms, and we found that vendors were most likely unaware of our needs surrounding DEI because we hadn't necessarily communicated those effectively. So after looking at all of those things and kind of seeing where we were, I had to set some project objectives. And the first was to determine our community to establish diversity standards. We did not want to assume that we knew who we were serving. Fort Worth is growing and diversifying, and we needed to have a better idea of who our community actually was. The second was to look at our collection and evaluate it for areas that were severely lacking diversity. And the third was to establish best practices for the Health Science Center and for vendor communication moving forward. So it turns out that the first objective was actually the easiest in this project. I was able to reach out to our marketing department and use our fact book to get some information about our faculty, staff, and student populations, which you can see presented in this lovely infographic that they made for me. Then I used a tool that we subscribe to called Policy Map to actually access and compile US Census data for our immediate areas where we regularly provide outreach and medical services. So while this says Fort Worth demographics, I actually expanded into some of the rural areas that we serve to get a better idea of where, what our population might actually look at. So while our area that we utilize and our staffing is predominantly white, our community is diversifying at a very quick rate. And our collection needs to reflect the changes that are coming. 40% of our population actually identifies as Hispanic, and almost 12% of our community is over the age of 65, and we know that they have very different health needs. And 26% are under the age of 18, which again is a totally different group, which were not well represented within our collection. But HSC and its community is more than just who lives and works in the area. It's also the areas of research that directly affect us. So we had to take these into consideration as well. And these include our Texas Center for Health Disparities, where we do research with racial and ethnic minorities. We do a lot of work with diabetes, cancer, HIV, women in underserved and low-income communities in North Texas, obesity, cancer, diseases that tend to hit very specific cultural groups. We also have the Center for Healthy Aging that really focuses on the human body as it progresses towards old age, the Institution for Translational Research. And then we do a lot of outreach in rural communities and with transgender healthcare, which has become a big issue in the state of Texas. So with this data in hand, we knew kind of what we were wanting to look for within our collection to make sure that we had information about the areas and populations that we served. So how did we go about this evaluation of our collection? Well, we started with the visual databases. We spot checked images to ensure that there was a representation of multiple skin tones throughout the databases. Some did this much better than others. There was a lot of areas where this could be improved upon. Some of our databases were more disappointing than others, but as I'll get to later, some of this has improved. We looked at our individual subscription titles next. We decided to those were things that we had focused on, that we decided as an individual title that wasn't part of a package. It was important enough for us to pay for. And we started looking at those, noticing that a lot of them were very traditional and not a lot of them focused on specific groups or embraced diversity in the way that potentially we might want it to. We then looked at our larger database and package collections. We did this through some title list evaluations. And again, sometimes that was really helpful because information is clearly reflected in the title, but sometimes the information just wasn't where we wanted it to be. Then we started looking at our book content. And we did this by creating a list of search terms, and we used our catalog and discovery layer in order to search for those terms to see what kind of book holdings we had in those subject areas. And finally, we made our comprehensive list of vendors because all of this work was going to be nothing if I couldn't communicate with my vendors. So, of course, we ran into roadblocks. There isn't a project on the planet that goes off 100% smoothly. It just doesn't happen, and we all know that. So we ran into a lot of different issues, and we discovered that the information that we were looking for was not always necessarily available to us. Our first roadblock that we came across was DEI as a definition. We found that different groups on campus actually viewed DEI differently, and that the library definition had to vary based on our collection goals and our defined community and research needs. So the library decided to use the general definition provided by Oxford for diversity, which says it is the practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and of different genders, sexual orientations, etc. We actually kept this definition very general because we believe it's going to allow us to adapt long-term without reevaluation of our definition as a whole. And anytime we can set standards which are going to be available and useful to us for multiple years at a time, we try to do that. Then we found going through and searching through our discovery layer in our catalog that a lot of times there was a lack of relevant metadata. Records for items are often fairly incomplete or lack relevant terms that would have made some titles stand out. Also, there are terms in metadata which are no longer used. So when we did that search, we kind of had to go back and think about how might this have been referred to in previous standards. So that meant looking for some items in the catalog that potentially my search terms could have been deemed as offensive, but it pulled up relevant materials which have historical basis, so that we were able to kind of get a better idea of what we had. We also had some staffing and timeline issues. Evaluations for this project were completed by me and a single technician who was my assistant at the time, who has since left HSC. There's only so much that a single person can really accomplish when you are looking at a collection. You do the best that you can, and you compile the data that you can, and you move on in order to move your process forward. The volume of the collection became problematic. And while these numbers that you see, over 25,000 journals, 500,000 active links, and we have large packages, many of which were shared with other universities within our system, that meant that I did not have control over the content in that. And while these are smaller numbers than some major universities, when you are the only person that deals with all of these electronic links and packages, that's a lot. It's a lot to go through. And so it became a little bit of an issue being able to evaluate things in the way that I would necessarily have liked to. Sometimes you have to go, you know what, this is as good as I can do. I'm just one person, and embrace that. And finally, we had a historic lack of communication about diversity as a whole. Vendors were absolutely unaware of our needs in this area because honestly, we had not focused on this area. And so no one was telling them that it was something that we were interested in. You do some assuming as an electronic resources librarian, and sometimes you forget that vendors are like your coworkers and your spouse are not mind readers, and that unless you communicate with them, they're just not going to know. But we also weren't communicating with all of the library staff, and our faculty also weren't communicating this as a need, or even were aware of this need. So that meant I had a problem, I had a project, and of course you have to come up with solutions. So these were mine. First of all, in order to keep my sanity, I decided that we would focus on what we would control. And for us, that boils down to these three things. I can control my individual subscriptions. I can pick and choose what it is that I am subscribing to. And if it doesn't meet our new criteria, I do not have to continue subscribing to an individual title. Those are items which I can choose to cancel if I want to. I can also look at who we do business with. Is there a way for me to get the same information from another vendor that embraces diversity on a better level? Sometimes, as you all know, the answer to that is no, but sometimes the answer is possibly or yes. And so we can work with that. And I can control our new purchases. I am the person that all new purchase requests come through. And so I absolutely have control over what that looks like and what kinds of things that we buy. The next solution was to start with where we were. What that meant is we did not remove items from our collection. We did not attempt to cancel existing contracts. Everything that we have within our collection was selected for a reason, and those reasons are normally still valid. They were just missing a new component, and it wasn't fair for me to suddenly cancel something that had been in place and in use for a long time simply because the vendors didn't know this was needed and it wasn't something that we had looked at before. So I decided that we would make changes going forward. And for us, that meant that we set best practices. I am a big fan of best practices. I think that you really need those standards in the way that you do things throughout the library in order for things to be done the same way and for consistency to occur. So we changed our review process for new purchases, and we included DEI as a purchasing and evaluation factor on all of our review forms that we use when we're deciding on whether or not to bring a new resource on board. The Collection Development Committee, which I chair, totally evaluated and updated our collection development policy and incorporated DEI into that policy in multiple areas. We began to actively seek out new resources which fit our new goals. And I created communication forms and standards that we now use throughout the library and across campus. And finally, after all of that, we began to communicate both internally and externally. So our vendor communication with regards to DEI looks like this. This is the letter that I drafted outlining our requirements and expectations. You can actually access a copy of this letter via the QR code that's on your screen, or you can email me. My email address is within the app and it'll be on the screen later. And I will happily email you a copy of the letter for you to use and adapt as needed. So once this letter was drafted and we began sending it out, then that's when I talked to our vendors about these needs. I actually require for all vendors, all new vendor reps have a meeting with me where we specifically discuss DEI as a purchasing impact factor for us. Over the last year, that has meant that for some companies, I have had this meeting 4 times for one company, but it's important for the vendor who is working with us to understand these expectations, and that if they fail to abide by these expectations, we can choose not to do business with them. So our initial vendor response, our email campaign of letters to vendors was initially limited to 21 vendors. And we only sent out stuff to people that we felt would be most affected by this DEI initiative. So out of those 21, we received email responses from 11. None of those responses were negative. I was thrilled. So they were very happy to talk to me about their diversity initiatives. Our Wiley rep actually shared our letter with other universities, leading to meetings with UVA about our efforts. And we received this lovely response, which I won't go into, from a vendor who we chose not to do business with because he was thanking us for being prepared for the future. And this was actually just the beginning for us. So we actually saw a change in how our vendors communicated with us, and thanks to our established best practices, how we respond and initiated communication with them changed. So my emails became more relevant, which is great. I stopped receiving a lot of useless emails and started receiving tailored emails that fit what I wanted. I'm not saying I don't get those mass emails generated by systems, because I do, but the ones that I get from my actual vendor reps are more insightful and meaningful to what I need. Contract negotiations were far more focused, and my vendors actually leveraged DEI as a selling point and were willing to alter our packages to include more diversity, often at no additional charge for us. I have regularly scheduled meetings. I try to hold quarterly meetings and the DEI introductory meetings for all new vendors and for our representatives from each company. And this open dialogue has allowed us to have a more honest exchange on both parts and made my job easier because everyone understands the needs that I'm focused on. So quickly, what were the effects of the collection? Well, first of all, we added over $12,000 in DEI-focused ebook titles over the last 2 years by negotiating product in place of an annual access fee with a single vendor. We added 3 new image-heavy databases, 1 in fiscal year 21 and 2 in fiscal year 22 at a null cost increase to the library by renegotiating package cost with a vendor who provides us access to those things. We spend out free book money on DEI titles that are actually recommended by vendor lists. So these are books that we select directly from emails that I receive from my vendors. We have added an individual journal subscription, just a single one at this point, because we're being extremely picky about that, and our funding for individual journal subscriptions is more limited. But this one is actually for a marginalized population that is served within our community. And we really highly leverage interlibrary loan over automatic purchases of items that do not fit these diversity guidelines within our new purchasing format. So where do we go from here? What are our next steps? Well, first, the letter campaign continues, and we sent out one to everybody that did not receive one in the first year. We add DEI evaluation to all contracted resources up for renewal, and we are requiring vendors to provide a DEI response as part of the renewal process for us to include in their contract file. We are continuing to evaluate our collection for gaps in research materials. And our future goal is now to add accessibility as a purchasing factor as we move forward. All of this is going to be a continuous process for us. And with the establishment of the new best practices, it's become much easier to continue this work than it was to initially instigate it. So that is what I have for y'all today. Thank you so much for having me and listening, and I will answer any follow-up questions at the end.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your interesting session. Well, our next presenter is Micha Broadnax. Please, Micha.
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Micha Broadnax, and my pronouns are she, they. I reside on the ancestral land of the Nonotuck people, also known as Western Massachusetts. I present today as a person supported by many. In addition to my ancestors and family, I have the fortune to be laboring and caring with practiced and smart colleagues willing to explore and consider ways of making information more accessible. Through the Black Teacher Archive Project, I have engaged catalogers, digitization specialists, conservationists, metadata specialists, digital librarians, archivists, rare book curators, and digital humanities librarians, along with reference librarians, and that's just to name a few. This community of folks that have shared information, expertise, and labor are making possible the publications of Black educators to be rendered available online. This presentation is entitled Efforts in Centralizing a Scattered Network, Reflections on the Black Teacher Archive. This project is a little over 1.5 years old and very much so still in progress. The work of coordinating the efforts associated with the project has required ongoing reflection and introspection. As we build community, seeing to the task of preserving and making accessible the legacy of Black educators as evidenced in rare periodicals. This project sprang from the imagination of two scholars and storytellers. I serve as the project manager of this Andrew W. Mellon Foundation supported initiative, conceived and awarded to Dr. Jarvis Givens and Dr. Amani Perry, and supported by the Harvard Graduate School of Education. As co-principal investigators, this project has been guided by a careful recognition of absence and challenge to access of the records of Black educator organizations. Dr. Givens' book, published last year, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, demonstrates how Woodson utilized the network of Black educator organizations to disseminate recognition of Negro History Week, the predecessor to Black History Month, in addition to curriculum, pedagogy, and decoration kits. And May We Forever Stand, A History of the Black National Anthem by Dr. Perry, traces the cultural dissemination of this song created by the Johnson brothers, which was formalized in the classroom. The Black Teacher Archive centers professional organizations historically referred to as colored teacher associations, which formed a robust professional republic as early as 1861. Statewide associations formed in Southern states during Reconstruction and in some Northern and Midwestern states during Jim Crow. Black teachers founded CTAs to enhance educational opportunities for Black children and to develop themselves as professionals, political actors, and intellectuals. These Black organizations existed dually as other state organizations were restricted to white educators. Racial restrictions on memberships maintain a dual education system under Jim Crow. As we know, Brown v. Board of Education decided in 1954 ended segregation with all deliberate speed. So while segregation was ruled unconstitutional, segregationist states were not forced to immediately adopt. As a result, by 1970, the US government and the National Education Association forced existing CTAs to merge with white professional associations with a wave of desegregation efforts. This merging, or absorption, as some people called it, has resulted in an erasure and loss of educational opportunity for Black students to have Black teachers. The result of integration included the loss of jobs for Black educators, white flight to private schools, and a professional network that developed to support the specific needs of Black students to be collapsed. Invested in the project of education from people who are legally not allowed to be literate, that had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect, as decided in Plessy v. It was through recently freed people that public education became a national project, while separate and unequal persisted in terms of teacher salary, textbooks, and school buildings. It is important to note the two critical texts in understanding why Black people chose education as a critical means of enfranchisement. Historian Heather Andrea Williams documented the immeasurable risks enslaved Black people engaged in to have access to books in their quest to learn to read. Her book, Self-Taught African-American Education in Slavery and Freedom, demonstrates the extraordinary efforts literate slaves engaged in to teach others to learn to read. This work, coupled with James Anderson's seminal work, The Education of Blacks in the South, helps us to better understand why learning to read, becoming teachers, and challenging all forms of racism led to the activism and advocacy we see in the development and the devotion of Black teachers who form colored teacher associations. Now on to the material. Colored teacher associations created programs, meeting minutes, agendas, photographs, proceeding records, and publications. The publications were distributed as part of membership dues and were the most public and serialized offering of the organization. To get a visual idea, here's a map of the United States, and the states highlighted in yellow indicate that to which a Black educator organization existed. As you'll note, this map shares a close resemblance to Confederate and border states, in addition to current states that have historically Black colleges and universities. In North Carolina, Black educators organized statewide under the organization of North Carolina Teachers Association. Its growth and service to the Black community used the resources and network of local historically Black colleges and universities, such as Shaw University, Winston-Salem State University, and North Carolina Central University. These were the sites of summer teacher training programs of students who would become community leaders in the form of educators. In 1930, the NCTA published their official organ, North Carolina Teachers Record, and continued to do so until their 1970 merger with the North Carolina Education Association to form the North Carolina Association of Educators today. In the late 1970s and early 80s, a partnership of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and the National Education Association enlisted former CTA leaders to write books on organizational histories and impacts. This moment of introspection and historicizing made clear the challenge to writing such a history without organizational records, such as the journal. For the states that integrated immediately after Brown v. Board, the journals that we've been able to source have been very scarce. As a trusted repository to document state history, the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill collection included over 200 copies of the NCTA publications, of which they have digitized in support of the Black Teacher Archive project. Uniquely, this project utilizes a non-custodial framework to create this digital archive. The goal of the project is not ownership or possession of physical material, but instead collective knowledge sharing made possible through the access point of the internet. As a disruption to archival practices, it intends to create what is professionally considered an artificial collection, yet honors the network in which those records were created. Through culling all this information together into a centralized repository, trends in the content of the journals can be viewed and examined like never before. While the aim is to centralize the material, the project team believes that Harvard systems should not be the singular point of access. In large, these Black educator publications are more scattered in their appearance in collections. The journals are part of personal papers, records of HBCU college presidents, periodical collections as part of library subscriptions, general collections, and rare book collections. We have contacted nearly 150 institutions to inquire about the existence of the journals or related records. We've reviewed OCLC catalogs, finding aids, ACTS librarians, archivists, and heads of libraries. Thus far, our efforts have resulted in nearly 50 contributing repositories participating with us so far, and the digitization of over 1,200 individual publications. The Black Teacher Archive, an online portal for centralizing and preserving the legacy of Black teachers before 1970, will provide researchers and educators with the tools to begin to closing the persistent gap and understand the political and intellectual contributions of African-American school teachers. In collaboration with various stewards and stakeholders, the Black Teacher Archive will locate and make publicly and freely available online the national and state publications of professional organizations of Black educators, historically known as CTAs. As part of this work, we have created a number of different workflows, one of which includes thinking about how do we even get the material to digitize. As you see on the right corner, we have the methods include requesting that folks digitize the material in-house when possible, enlisting a local vendor or a DPLA hub, temporarily loaning the material to Harvard in our imaging services, and sometimes me using interlibrary loan. Digitizing these serials make possible for state comparisons and trends. Centering this phase of the project on publications gives a measurable insight on what we have and what is missing according to the practice of volume and issue numbers. This project is made possible through the support of Harvard Graduate School of Education and Harvard Library, an umbrella organization for the libraries associated at the various schools that provides strategy and infrastructure for key components related to this project, such as digitization and discovery and access. The institution has seen its share of projects that create boutique portals and databases as part of grant fulfillments. In recognition of the long-term sustainability, this project has aimed to use the systems of practice currently in use. In moments when these are not the most ideal for the collection, there has been community advocacy on how tools could improve to benefit this collection, but in turn, all digital collections actually. One of those feats included the current development of full text searching for Harvard-wide digital collections. While in contrast to other possible documents created by CTAs, serials are often associated with issue level information, such as date, volume, and issue numbers. Serials are sometimes inconsistent with an accidental typo, as we all know, on the value numbers, a duplication of the issue number, and frequency and publication changes.
Mhm.
In addition, serials sometimes experience a change in organization or journal title. As a serial publication collection, it has been fruitful to be in conversation and have catalogers on the team. To see the creating body's names change over time, along with the publications and variances and frequencies, and accounting for that in a community of practice that has traditions and norms has been interesting for me to encounter as a colleague with a specialization in outreach and archives. Of the color teacher associations, there are 15 states and the nation's capital that publish an official organ. Also, some organizations publish newsletters or other distributed and serialized publications, as we came to find out. We decided to include all those in the scope for this project. In consultation with catalogers, we made the decision to catalog the journals and update, or in some case, create OCLC records for global locating of these records. Also, describing the material at this level contributes to researchers being able to see where copies are distributed and improves bibliographic control. Taking seriously the front page of the publications, as catalogers do, has resulted in the creation of 34 journal and newsletter titles. Fidelity to the first page creates a true representation of journal decisions and indicators. It also places us in the space of having multiple journals called bulletin or inconsistencies on how the journal or how the author is denoted in the catalog record. While in some instances, there's a clear format change from magazine style to newspaper, more often the title change for the magazine or the organization, yet the content remained generally the same, and the publication numbers correspond to recognizing the publication as a continuation. Thank goodness for the Mark 780 field. These serials are first described locally in ALMA, our integrated library system for cataloging, and are brought together by an artificial series called Harvard Graduate School of Education Black Teacher Archive. Attached to the record are list views, as seen in this online access piece right here, of individual URNs for each issue in the online access link. The subjects and notes fields are dependent on how the material has already been cataloged. Given our catalogers' unique perspective to see all these journals across state lines and in one virtual place, we're continuing conversations and considerations on what should be considered standardized practice that we should be applying. With the end goal of a digital portal, users are likely expecting a description of the journals at the item level. Not to mention in this case, at the item level, we can share unique information about which organization is in possession of the physical copy or the name of the organization that performed the digitization. While cataloging best practices is to describe at the title level and create one record that derives from an analog world in which that would be sufficient information for a researcher to know if they should ask more questions or visit an institution. That is unsuitable for a digitized collection. Researchers should be able to filter and view the journals as individual items linked through certain metadata fields, such as creator or journal title. This is where the current efforts are developing. Harvard Library has decided that all metadata should be based in a system of record. Those records include ALMA, that integrated catalog, JSTOR form for visual resources, or archive space for a description of archival materials, which are used for the next phases, which we'll be using for the next phases of our descriptive work. We are currently workshopping possibilities of turning encoded archival description, EAD, into mods in Harvard's Library Cloud Aggregative Service, which provides API access to descriptive metadata. This API underlies the metadata in our discovery points of our digital collections and also our exhibit builder, Curiosity, which will serve as the portal for the BTA project. This has been an iterative process open to multiple points of reconsiderations. As we seek to rebuild this network, we are forming a network of our own of contributors and library and archive experts invested in preserving and making accessible the legacy of Black educators. This project has granted us the opportunity to review local systems and practices and determine possibilities to expand capacity or be creative in approach. We are still very much trying to figure out the experience of the item level metadata in addition to the mechanics. I thank you for the opportunity to share a bit about the Black Teacher Archive, and I welcome any questions you may have. And on this slide, I would be remiss if I didn't at least create space to acknowledge a number of my colleagues that I work closely with, in addition to the folks at UNC Chapel Hill that helps coordinate digitizing those records. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for your interesting presentation. So yeah, we have I have an off-camera moderator. Yeah, Anthony, he's helping me to collect the questions from the Hover chat. So yeah, let's look at the questions. Let me go through. And I think, yeah, the first question is for Elizabeth. So you mentioned that large packages were shared among others was a barrier to your project. Do you think you would say if others are interested in sharing the workload for those large packages?
For us, we did not reach out to the other two libraries in our university system because we are a medical university. So the types of things that we were looking for wouldn't necessarily have been the same as what they were looking for. We have actually, since this project began, we have actually separated those packages out so that we now have our own package, which I was able to better customize to our needs. So now it's very different. And if I was evaluating today, my process would be slightly different. But at the time, because of what I was looking for example, the University of North Texas in Dallas is a law school. So they would definitely not have been looking for the same information as I was. And UNT Denton is a traditional 4-year university. So our needs were so different that sharing that load really wasn't going to help me get the information that I needed to broaden my collection.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. We have another
I'm sorry,
question from-
Micah. Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. So Micah, here's the question for you. So yeah, what you shared is very informative and valuable. And what you have done to make all the resources to be public aware, I mean.
I'm sorry, Shigan, can you repeat that question? You said all the efforts to make, yeah, I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, make all your resources to be aware by the public, not just within the institutions, within your institution.
Yes, yeah, I think ethically when we started the project, we wanted to contend with and acknowledge the name that Harvard carries and also the history and legacy. And so we really intend to make the material as widely available as possible. Imagining the material being in DPLA, wanting the material to also be in our contributor repositories and perhaps maybe linked to the Black Teacher Archive, but really hoping to have a distributed open access network of folks that can see this corpus of material in one place.
Thank you, Michael. And well, so the next question is for Elizabeth. So what was the time frame for the project from Sarah Hamilton?
We began this project in late June, early July of 2020. So the initial evaluation had to be done quite quickly. I was done evaluating as much as I could by October so that we really began sending out the letters at that time frame. We're still, of course, evaluating. This is going to be a never-ending process. Our collection development changes to the policies that we had took a little longer because that has to go through a committee. So we began editing that in the fall of 2020, and it was finally voted and passed through in May of 2021. So each piece has kind of been at a different time frame, but overall started late June because, June 12th of 2020 was when Dr. Taylor made his statement, and we got together as a library and said, okay, how are we going to comply with these new rules across campus? So we made some decisions fairly quickly and began late June, early July, and we're still working through it. I don't see it ending anytime soon. I think I have my policies and procedures in place, but the actual evaluation is ongoing. Every time I get a new request for a resource, we're still working through that. We're still fine-tuning things.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. So for Micha, the next question is, so yeah, you mentioned that the Color Teacher Association, look at the map you shared. It's covered the South and the Eastern region. So wonder if the West and the Middle West have the similar teacher association, or are you also trying to collect the materials from over there?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, historically, those associations existed in the South, but interestingly, for this project, that doesn't mean that the materials are limited to those locations. So we have partners as far as like California and Oregon who actually have material and records from these educators in the South, because we know that people move around, and that there was a national organization, the American Teachers Association, in which for any Black educator could be a part of, but the centered effort was really against the repression and the outright segregation in the South.
Thank you, Micha. So next question for Elizabeth. So what are the potential issues or ramifications of DEI project in the state of Texas with Texas' most recent government laws and statements?
Yeah, the state of Texas does not always appear to be the most welcoming or embracing of diversity as a whole. We are lucky as a medical institution that we are actually encouraged to diversify based on the population, and our collection should reflect that. Some of our counterparts, though, in, for example, elementary schools, not so much. There are some things that have passed here in Texas recently that make it extremely difficult for people that are not, I have to be very careful about how I word it. It's the university system that I work for, and universities as a whole across the state of Texas are embracing DEI projects wholeheartedly. And I am lucky enough to work for a university where our provost and our president and the university system as a whole really wants us to provide these resources and to promote diversity in hiring practices, in student retention, and enrollment, and throughout our library collection. So we're lucky that they let trained librarians make those decisions. That is not true. Like I said, across the state of Texas, school librarians are having a very hard time right now with materials that are considered diverse in their collection being challenged and removed. So I'm lucky in where I work and that I can do these projects, but I'm also very aware that across the state, not all librarians have this luxury.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We have 2 minutes left. We can have the last question. So yeah, I would like to refer to Micha. So thank you, Micha mentioned the complexity of a serious cataloging, because I'm a serious cataloger. So I wonder if you like or catalogers, you know, when you work together, experience any like inclusive language issues when you're cataloging or creating metadata description?
Thank you for that question. I think because it's the serials, and I think the area for us to kind of explore more are those subject tags that have been attached. Right now, my catalogers have been in conversation and really want to honor how other people have cataloged the information. And I kind of try to allude to this, that we're at a unique space in which we've seen a wide mass of them. And so thinking around like what possibilities to intervene on the language do we have, but also wanting to recognize that there have been folks before this project who have cared for this material and tried to point people to it. So that's an ongoing area. And for the most part, a lot of the terms that are described at the title level are not offensive. They're just context-based, such as like what Black people were referred to, or what was the name for African Americans at that time.
Thank you, Michael, for your response. So I think, we are almost done. Our time is almost done. So any questions from audience? Well, so I would like to thank you everyone for like coming to the presentation. Thank you for the presenters for your wonderful presentation. So all our sessions are being recorded, and recordings and slides will be made available to registered attendees in the coming weeks. If you have any questions about this session, please reach out to the speakers via email. Thank you to all for our attendees, to the speakers for your great presentations. Again, have a wonderful day.